So we move to Joshua. We've done those first 5 books. They're called the Pentateuch or the Torah, and it's all about origins and then through to the children of Israel on their journey towards the promised land. And Joshua is all about the time when you're going to move from the wilderness time. Wilderness, and now they're camped on the eastern bank of the Jordan River. They're very close. They could almost smell the promised land. They could see it. They could see it. But after all this time, I wonder if they could even believe that they were actually going to enter into the promised land. But the book of Joshua, it's a book of conquest. It's a book about the fulfillment of God's promise after all the years of slavery in Egypt and then the wandering around in the wilderness. Now they are here with a new leader. It begins with, now Moses is dead. So it's a new time, it's a new leader, it's a new opportunity. And after all these years and years, 40 years in the wilderness, the children of Israel are about to enter into the promised land. And the book begins with that whole story about the transfer, the progression, the succession of leadership of the children of Israel from Moses until Joshua. Joshua, in his early life, he was called Hoshea. That's Hoshea, and that name literally means salvation. But then Moses, some years before, had renamed him, and he says, you're not going to be called Hoshea anymore, you're going to be called Joshua, which means the Lord saves, or the Lord gives victory. And the Greek version of Joshua is no less a name than Jesus. And so in many ways, Joshua becomes like a forerunner of Jesus, who was going to not only save the people out of Egypt, but also bring them into the promised land. God wants to bring you into a promised land, and that is just a great story. The author of the book of Joshua, they're not very sure. Some people think it was Joshua. Some people think that Samuel had a hand in it. But it's not one of those books that is very clear. There's a bit of a transition between the 5 generally thought of books of Moses, and now the story is starting to develop. So they're not very, very sure. What is the purpose of the book? Well, it is a setting out of the account of the fulfillment of the prophetic word to the children of Israel all those years before, that God would bring them into a land that was flowing of milk and honey. And this is an account to prove that God did what he said he would do. And by the way, God will always do what he said he would do. And it was to remind them that if they will only respond with obedience to God's plan and God's way, then God would bring them through. Joshua was known throughout all of his years as a man who trusted in God. He'd actually been on the journey with Moses right from the beginning. He was in Egypt during the slavery time. He'd watched the plagues happen. He was there on the day that they marched out of Egypt. He was on the day that they walked through the Red Sea. He was there in the good times, some bad times as well. Faithful, 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 faithful. So the book of Joshua, the book of the leadership of this man now over the children of Israel, is the story of a man who had been faithful. And that's the requirement that God is looking for us. If you want God to trust you with greatness, and you want God to give you a responsibility for his kingdom in the days that are coming, then take a page out of Joshua's book and be faithful, stay faithful. He was faithful to God. He was faithful to Moses. He was faithful to the children of Israel. An occasional little blip, like when Moses went up the mountain and he let the golden calf be made. But mostly Moses was known as being a man of great faithfulness. And then the book, when I said a little minute ago, Moses is dead, the next words in the beginning of Joshua is, now you. And then in that succession, it was like, right, that's Moses, he's done, he's over, he's finished, now you. And then in this first chapter, there's one of my favorite verses, my life verse really, about God calling him to be full of courage and strong because he was going to lead these people to inherit the land. And the book then unfurls over the next pages. You've got the stories of Rahab and the spies. You've got the stories of the crossing of the Jordan. Now, of course, he'd already seen God do that in the Red Sea, so it was no great surprise when he opened the Jordan. But it had been 40 years since something like that had happened, so it was an incredible miracle. And then there was the conquest of Jericho. Then there was the failure that happened through disobedience in Ai. Then there was the time when the sun stood still. That's a story in itself. I haven't got time to tell you about that. And then all the last chapters of Joshua are all about the systematic occupation of the promised land as the land was allotted to the 12 different tribes of Israel, including that very special story about Caleb, that old man. He was 40 when they started the journey. He'd been 40 years on the wilderness. He was now an older man, but he says, no, my eyes are bright and I'm full of energy. Give me this mountain. And he says, now come on, deliver on it. And Caleb was the man who then was really in that moment. He was excited for it. My verse that I'm picking, right at the end of the chapter, it's in Joshua 23, verse 8. It says, but you are to hold fast to the Lord. Joshua 23, verse 8. But you are to hold fast to the Lord your God as you have until now. Joshua's sitting down with his leaders. He's right at the end of his life. It's right at the end of the chapter. It's also the end of his life. He'd been around a long time. He'd seen the good things and the bad things. But at the end of his life, a little bit like we saw in Deuteronomy just now, he's saying, when I look back, these are the important things. And the important thing that Joshua is saying after all of this journey, all those 40 years with Moses, all that time, all of the time that he'd led the children of Israel himself, when he sat with his leaders, he said the biggest thing, hold fast to the Lord. He'd looked back, but hold fast. The word hold fast means to be joined, so joined to God that you are like stuck to him. It isn't just, come by the side of, it's get stuck to, stick together, united. And what some of the translations have, cling. You're clinging to God. You're so close. Some people have a pick up, drop down type relationship, but we're not supposed to have a pick up, drop down sort of relationship. We're supposed to have a relationship with God that sticks, that clings, that we're stuck, and we aren't for moving what at all. So what is the relevance for us today? The promised land, as we found out in Numbers, could have come earlier, but disobedience kept them a long way. We need to remember that, brothers, sisters. Let's obey the Lord with all of our hearts. Let's be ready to do his will, do his way. It is a short circuit to the land that's flowing with milk and honey. Disobedience takes us on the long journey. Jericho shows us what God can do. Jericho can show us that God can bring down the walls. He can do miracles. And Ai shows us that if we're disobedient, then we lose it all over the place. The book of Joshua is a book of crossing over. It's a book of occupying. It's a book of contrasts. Obeying brings blessing. Disobedience makes it hard. I want to encourage you, cling, hold fast to the Lord. That's the story of the book of Joshua.